power, and relationality in contemporary times. The panel aims to delve into the intricate relationship between plural knowledge, tradition, and praxis within Asia's culturally diverse social fabric in relation to the law. Knowledge systems and practices embeddedness in a community aims to uncover the profound impact relationality on knowledge creation, sharing, and utilization across various domains. The paper presented in this session will undertake an examination of pluralism and relationality of knowledge and practice under changing legal frames and the emergence of new hierarchies. The ultimate goal of the session is to enhance our understanding of the responses of knowledge, traditions, and cultural expressions to legal interventions and the shifts triggered by these interventions. The panel is chaired by Professor V. Sujata. She is a professor at the Center for the Study of Social Systems, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She specializes in the fields of sociology of knowledge and sociology of health and medicine. Her monograph, titled Sociology of Health and Medicine, New Perspectives, addressed contemporary conceptual and historical concerns in the sociological inquiry into health and medicine in the Global South. More recently, she has edited the volume Global Capital and Social Difference in 2020, consisting of research papers by authors from different continents to provide alternatives to Eurocentric theories of globalization. The presenters of the panel are Nritya Pillai. She's a dancer, singer, writer, and speaker, and dance pedagogue. She stands at the center of a complex genealogy of hereditary professional dance artists. Born into families led by dance masters on both paternal and maternal sides, who marginally participated in the reinvention by continuing to be teachers for the dominant caste star dancers of the post-1930s period. Carving out her own space as a performer, Nritya represents a new kind of artistic and intellectual engagement with the troubled history of Bharatanatyam. She dramatically challenges the power relationships and ideologies that make the form unavailable to women of her community and advocates fiercely for the restoration of credit for Bharatanatyam, technique, repertoire, and philosophy to the hereditary community of practitioners. Dr. Rai Ganguly is the second speaker for the panel. She has completed her PhD in sociology from the Center for the Study of Social Systems in Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi in 2022. She has pursued her graduation and post-graduation in English from Jadavpur University, followed by a second post-graduation and MPhil in sociology. She has a multidisciplinary approach towards research with interests in gender and governance, sociology and law, economy and society. Post her doctorate, she has been a visiting fellow at the Institute of Feminist Legal Studies at the Osgoode Hall Law School in York University before starting her teaching career. She is currently an assistant professor in the School of Liberal Arts as well as the School of Law at the IMS Unison University, Dehradun.
It's working.
It's working.
ठीक है you want to cut that? This is working. You take this. Okay.
Hello everyone, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel on knowledge, traditions and the law. The creative theory colloquium has always been welcoming in looking at old things in a new way, new things in a new way, and new things in an old way. And we'll figure our positions here. And so we are able to test, experiment with new kinds of ideas and practices, new combination of panelists. So thank you, Manindra and Savita, for making this possible. The knowledge, traditions, and the law, there's so much of discussion on traditional knowledge that we have to separate ourselves from jingoistic understandings of traditionalism or glorification. And also of notions of fossilized tradition that is out there, romanticized, and then you have the evil modernity here trying to destroy capitalism, etc. which is not how things have evolved. And the way, if you look at the contemporary dynamics, I want to start by giving you a metaphor, a story which is widely narrated in traditional knowledge circles, that a man from one of the traditional communities, he went in front of an audience and he wielded a dagger. He said, this dagger is 700 years old and we have been possessing it for so many different generations. Everybody was captivated. Here is this dagger of 700 years old, handed over for several generations. He said, we totally safely. Occasionally we had to change the handle a couple of times and the knife a couple of times. Otherwise, it's the very same dagger. So this is what we understand by tradition. This is not to say that there is no, so therefore we have to ask what is the core, what is the essence of. And there's been a long debate on tradition, modernity as binaries. I want to steer clear of these binaries. And before our esteemed speakers start, I only want you to consider this frame to understand the transitions in knowledge traditions. And thereby we don't look at them as frozen, fossilized, romanticized, epistemological entities. I'd urge you to consider knowledge traditions in the classic Marxist lens of existential base and thinking, and from where we can develop. So I draw your attention to ontology and epistemology, and not just do an epistemology of traditional knowledge systems. Then we are in a very rich ground. We can also modify the classic Marxist proposition, like, so when I go to a village, a rural area to study health practices with this very strong view that it's deeply connected to their existential practices, I find that a whole lot of concepts and ideas that these people in the villages articulate are not connected to their existential conditions, but to textual knowledge of body and health, vata, pitta, kapha, so there seems to be a symbiotic relationship to regional canonized knowledge and what we call people's folk knowledge, which I think, so therefore I would think that if we are looking at knowledge traditions, we should think of them not merely as knowledge or epistemologies. We should consider 4 essential aspects of these knowledge systems or practices. First is the knowledge or the practice and all that goes with it. If it's a performance, you have techniques, you have strategies, you have concepts, you have a certain method of carrying out that knowledge. So that is one. But then you have a community or a strata or a class which is the protagonist of that knowledge at a particular point in time. Sometimes the knowledges change. Ayurveda was done by Ayurveda and Unani were practiced by Hakims. And why? Today it is graduates in who have studied life sciences who are doing it. So you can't understand the Ayurveda of 100 years ago in the same way that you understand the Ayurveda today, because these people have no familiarity with herbs. So that is, second is the community, third is their livelihood or their existential base. And by adding to the classical Marxist proposition, I would suggest that we should look at the larger cultural context or the other, other communities, or what I call the ecology of knowledge in the particular region, which influences the knowledge and practices of a given community. So there is interaction, there is relationality. We cannot view knowledge systems in isolation. They are in constant interaction and integration and conflict with a whole ecology of knowledge in a given space. And lastly, we have macro factors like the state, the market, and other kinds of things. There's a lot of literature on the influence of the market, commodification of traditional knowledges, etc. Therefore, to zero in and retain the analytical rigor of this field, I have chosen law, to focus on one aspect and how it influences traditional knowledges. So we have this panel here on traditions and the law. So we are looking at how law and legal interventions and public policies have made very drastic influences. They have caused drastic influence on knowledges, subjectivities, communities, methods, existential base, and so on. So we have a very colorful and a dynamic panel. I'm very happy to introduce to you. They've been introduced, but the themes cover a slightly wide range of thinking. So we have Nritya Pillai from Performance, and she's going to tell you the internal dynamics in which knowledge passes from one community to another. It gets appropriated and it changes in content and character. And she represents a practitioner and a pedagogue who is reclaiming the knowledge in this 21st century. So if you want to understand what's happened century of Bharatanatyam, like traditional bands by which knowledge or reinvents itself, we should leave those things aside and invent a new vocabulary. And I see this panel as a first step. And then we have the second piece of work, which looks, all that I said about knowledge also applies to commonsensical knowledge, which is not an ordinary thing. It's a most elusive thing. And so we have Raj, who is going to talk to you about how, the legal pluralism, how women's property rights are viewed by the community, the women, and by law, by customary law, and by, proper state law, which is private and public. And so how do you understand legal pluralism, and how is the legal subject being, how is the legal subject being foregrounded? So when you have a woman from Santali community and her property rights, will she fit and will she be liberated within courts if the individual base negotiate between these many regimes of law? And then we have Neelam, whose work is going to look at food systems of tribal communities in Chhattisgarh, and what are the policy changes, how they affect these systems, what changes and what remains of this whole knowledge systems. And together, I hope we'll be covering life, labor, and symbolic language in this panel. So with your permission, I will request Nritya Pillai to make her presentation. I'm looking forward to it as much as you do.
Thank you, Sujata. Hello, everyone. I'd like to begin by saying that it is wonderful to be participating as a Bahujan voice with a bit to make interventions related to our understanding of Bharatanatyam history and the practice. But so often, culture, and specifically dance, which today is almost entirely the realm of very elite Savarna women and some men, is sidelined in conversations around law. By extension, critical histories and grounded discussions of caste in the making of these modern art forms is also sidelined. I hope a change. For those of you who might think that Bharatanatyam is a thousands of years old, ancient and unbroken practice, that is simply not true. Bharatanatyam dance was radically altered in the third decade of the 20th century when its practice was repopulated by Brahmins, its repertoire and technique appropriated from Bahujans, and its history rewritten by cultural nationalists. The space for the shift was created over 100 of courtesans, which in South India reached its apex with the passing of the Devadasi Abolition Bill of 1927 that was later transformed into law in independent India as the Madras Devadasi's Prevention of Dedication Act of 1947. An ensuing project to reimagine and reinvent the dance form by caste elites led to the creation of Bharatanatyam as we know it today. A brief history of what happened in families like mine would would be crucial to narrate at this point. In a series of complex social and political events, the lives of hereditary art practitioners, particularly women from courtesan castes across South India, was dramatically changed, forever starting in the mid-19th century. By then, performances by Tamil and Telugu-speaking courtesans had come under public surveillance and critique in the Madras presidency. Over the period of a century, several strategic state-endorsed political and legal interventions outlawed dancing by women who were universally glossed over by the stigmatizing term Devadasi, a term inaccurately understood as a pan-Indian and trans-historical category. One of my many interventions has been to point out the disempowering nature of terms such as Devadasi, which re-inscribe trauma onto the bodies of young women from these castes today, like myself. In that vein, I attempt to use the term as sparingly as possible, except when it is unavoidable to provide historical context. I prefer to identify myself as a hereditary dancer and artist, and as someone from whose families the performance tradition of Bharatanatyam originates. Despite their own protests to the Madras government, these women's lifestyles were first criminalized in 1927, and later in 1947, independent India ratified this initial legal intervention, which is only a bill, by making it into a law. It is of course misguided to think that the colonial state banned courtesans, as we often hear in the media. Critical historical work clearly shows us that it was Indian nationalist elites and social reformers who created and led the entire process of reform, including all the legal interventions made against this community. Women in these families, our families, were dispossessed by the state of the tax-free land called Inam or Manyam that they owned on account of performing music and dance at royal courts or some Hindu temples. They were encouraged to purify themselves by entering to conjures such as Gandhi, Periyar and Muthulakshmi Reddy. They bear an irrevocable and deeply somatic stigma. They are still felt by young women in this community in both rural and urban contexts today, even after the establishment of caste endogamous for women as the community's norm. The fact of the matter is that the legislation did not eradicate this community. And today, young women from this community like me lead complex lives. Stigma, suspicion, and the negotiation of social identity are all deep and day-to-day issues managed by women in our community. In each of these contexts, they find themselves hinged to early 20th century representations that are difficult at best and debilitating at worst. Here I would argue censorship, understood as corporeal surveillance, the patrolling of moral and aesthetic boundaries and regulation of culture, lives in all its form, from the most explicit proscription of women's performance practices to the most subtle forms of local gossip. This kind of everyday gossip pervades not only rural social economies, but is a new industry of South India's classical dance and music. Today, the social category of the Devadasi is pervaded by historical fissures, lived trauma, a complex and problematic relationship with hegemonic, state-endorsed understandings of gender justice. As women in the courtesan community were being criminalized and opportunities for performance dwindled, elite Brahmin cultural nationalists like E. Krishna Iyer, Rukmini Devi, K. Subramaniam, and V. Raghavan took up the cause of saving the art of these women. They learned the art from the courtesans and their male dance masters or natonas, many of whom were very reluctant to engage in this project, and in the process, Brahmin elites transformed the courtesans' art into a vessel for Hindu cultural nationalism. The art form was given a Hindu past that was rooted in the Vedas and the Natya Shastra. This recrafting, including the labeling of certain art forms that were no longer practiced by Bahujans as classical, was done under the watchful eye and patronage of post-colonial Indian state that also had a major role in engineering India's national culture. The end result of this reinvention is perhaps most evident in the ways in which Bharatanatyam is deployed as a Hindu religious spectacle in today's India. From the 1930s to the present, stretching and pulling in various epistemic directions are sets of highly contentious attempts to reconstitute hereditary courtesan paths in the new economies of performance in urban South India. The bulk of such representations have come from outside the former hereditary dancing, especially from Brahmin women who since the 1930s have been engaged in acts of mimesis that produce vectors of appropriation and are also public cultural displays of caste-based power. In other words, when we think about it critically, every time Bharatanatyam is performed, it is a mimesis of the Bahujan dancing woman of the past. The costume, the ankle belts, the music, it all ultimately points back to the Bahujan courtesan. In the remainder of this talk, I want to reflect on the 21st century effects of this new legal and cultural machinery of the nation enabled the appropriation of Bharatanatyam's knowledge systems and then deliberately excluded those from whom the art was appropriated. At the heart of my argument lies the idea of what I'm calling reductionism, a composite way in which elites have reduced the history, sociology, aesthetics, and practice of Bharatanatyam into representations that remain palatable and empowering only to aspirationally Brahmin or Brahmin elites. Within the realm of this reductive structures, Brahmins and other caste elites claim of South Indian Brahmin women as performers, critiques, and publishers of journals, magazines, and what they consider to be research work on the art form, all at the same time. But the performer would be related to the critic, or the publisher of the magazine, or to a professor of dance in university, India, or abroad. An impregnable power structure akin to the old boys club has been established over time following the decentering of the hereditary performing communities of South India. In doing so, the knowledge systems, the practice, the pedagogy was largely Tamil Brahmin elites. The effort to delegitimize the lived realities and contributions by marginalized hereditary performers like my conservative website run by dancer Anita Ratnam, Nartaki.com, published a deeply casteist and scathing coming from diasporic universities. In the same, are celebrated for conforming to Venkatraman's vision of Bharatanatyam's history and practice. I should also point out that I am not the only one to draw attention to the caste and class politics undergirding this review. Artists and activists from Kathe Kuthu Sangam, for example, have spoken against it in their understanding of the folk and classical classification. This is not the first time that Venkatraman and her Brahmin colleagues at Nartaki.com have written about me, my politics, and my discussions of dance history. In December 2019, a review was published of my participation in a panel on caste and gender in Bharatanatyam that used threatening language, an incident that I wrote about and analyzed at length in an article for Economic and Political Weekly. Since the 2019 incident, I have traveled extensively, bringing my politics and performance to academic and political spaces, ranging from universities in India and the United States to the Tamil Nadu Progressive Writers and Artists Association. The radical change I fight for everyday representations of Bharatanatyam have no doubt shifted the discourse in some spaces, but not in the gatekeeping of the form that happens in Chennai's performing arts spaces called Sabas. Here, hereditary dancers are expected to conform to being inheritors of male lineages, boxed into archaic representations of temple dancers and other fantasy narratives that Brahmin women performers want to reduce us to. It is not backed by successful men in the community, but also have lived practices cannot be accommodated in the discourse of Bharatanatyam. Gatekeeping practices that have been in place since the reinvention in the 1930s, hierarchies and divisions of the good and the bad hereditary are, in other words, those who receive patronage and those who do not. Even the hereditary artists who receive Brahminic patronage are also marginalized and utilized strategically by the patrons, a game that I refuse to play. Now let's come back to the reductional Indic knowledge systems. Elites suppress possibilities for expressions of the dance's past or future that survive in traces and fragmentary forms among the dance's original Bahujan practitioners. Both the reinvention of the 1930s and then many attempts to revive the pre-reinvention dance that began again in the 1990s come with a reductionism of understanding of the dance form along a linear history. When hereditary dancers practiced it, it was called Sadir, and after reinvention, it became Bharatanatyam. This flattened and ahistorical understanding of the past comes with erasure of the even after the reinvention had occurred. The reductionist understanding in the Brahmin imagination ultimately based on articulating the aesthetic superiority of Brahmin embodiment leads naturally to the erasure of hereditary history. It allows room for more appropriative practices where elite Brahmin women can now claim to reconstruct and embody dance traditions they call Sadir, Vedasini Natyam and Devadasi dance and history. And this is done in the name of decolonization. In the case of the 1930s reinvention, the key goal for caste elite cultural nationalists was the separation of the dance from the Shudra bodies, intellect, identities, practices, and culture. Upper caste women like Rukmini Devi danced while proclaiming loudly and clearly that they were not immoral Sudra dancers from courtesan backgrounds, all while learning from hereditary male teachers of Bharatanatyam from the very same caste. The irony is the question of ownership at that point in time was answered through claims of democratization and secularization of the dance. Although what really happened was Sanskritization and perhaps most importantly Brahminization. In contrast to the project of the early 20th century, dancers like Rukmini Arunde, of early 20th centuries of dancers like Rukmini Arunde, we now have dancers who want to dress up and represent the hereditary dancer of the year. A full circle appropriation of the historical practice and the bodies that were excluded and continue to be excluded today in mainstream Bharatanatyam spaces, like the sabas and the classical dance venues. Incidentally, though these same dancers and academics from privileged castes, predominantly Brahmin locations, are able to conveniently participate in both spaces which exclude voices and bodies like mine, delegitimizing my lived experience and of caste-based exclusion. When asked about this phenomenon of Devadasi dress-up, something I think as akin to blackface, Bharatanatyam essentializing and re-exoticizing the figure of the Devadasi, which has been contested, problematized, and complicated by the work and writing contemporary scholars who are members of hereditary families. Mimicry always preserves psychological distance from the actual persons or cultural forms mimicked. As presented by Brahmin and upper caste performers, the hereditary dancer of the past, both becomes the exotic other, and reassuringly they see a familiar mommy next door. But most audiences construe what they see not as performance or misrepresentation of an identity, but as factual representation of it, especially when the performance of the upper caste dancer is bolstered by elite institutional scholarship. But you may ask, why is there a sudden move back to what upper caste artists were initially so insistent on denouncing? To understand this shift, we need to recognize that beginning in the late 1980s and the 1990s, women from Brahmin and upper caste backgrounds who were trained in Bharatanatyam, they also entered academic spaces, which were called performance studies and later critical dance studies, which were just taking shape in the global north. These spaces are today were and today continue to be fully populated by Brahmin and upper caste women dance scholars, mostly Tamil Brahmin and elite Bengali women. The phenomenon that then presents an apparent conflict of interest where the academician is not removed from the form they are critiquing. In fact, they form the very fraternity that they wish to study, reflect upon and interpret. So in the very early creation this performance studies category, the dance scholars produced a critique of the process by which dance forms like Bharatanatyam were reinvented, focusing on forces like nationalism, social reform, and most importantly on colonialism. The question of caste and caste-based exclusion in Bharatanatyam remained largely invisible in the analysis. One such dancer academician, Dr. Avanti Meduri, insists on the Orientalist gaze cast upon the art form's historiography, while not acknowledging the caste privilege gaze that this historiography has been replaced by. She talks about how it's written with white ink. This kind of work continues to be recognized in some circles as authoritative interpretation of Bharatanatyam's history. But she also continues to give lectures that actually unquestioningly celebrate Rukmini Arundel's 1930s project of the reinvention and Brahminization of Bharatanatyam, and upholds its value in today's majoritarian national imaginary. So the figure of the Brahmin scholar performer has taken on several manifestations. The critical dance studies world is full of such figures, especially those who implicate colonization and the colonizer for what's happened to the figure of the courtesan, but seldom talk about caste or their own caste privilege and their own role, very much determined by the inequality of the caste power and the intellectual superiority granted to the Brahmin or the dominant caste scholar through the power of academia. So I want to end my session by talking about how this coming December, a lot of dance studies faculty members from JNU Ashoka University will be speaking at the very space, the Natyakala conference, where many of the caste-based conflicts and humiliation I have experienced took place. When academics from nation seek the patronage of such explicitly that I make here. In fact, this year the Natyakala conference ends with a performance by Sonal Mansingh, a radical BJP Rajya Sabha MP and vociferous denier of caste-based inequality. Instead of resisting and refusing these spaces, JNU and Ashoka faculty willingly integrate themselves to the non-conforming Sudra performer. This dangerous and persistent nexus between academia and the very deeply entrenched spaces of cultural nationalism and Brahminism should be a concern for all of us, not only those of us who are invested in dance and performing arts. So the bigger question is, what transformative effect does this ongoing dance studies scholarship really have in social and socio-political terms for Bahujan practitioners? On the contrary, it might have enabled a new interest in the figure of the Devadasi and by extension affected renewed cycles of caste mimesis and dress-up performance. So the next time you'll hear that so-and-so is dancing Sadir or Vilasini Natyam, remember that these practices are all mired in deep problems of representation and caste-based power and control. Whether it is the performance of Bharatanatyam or scholarship on Bharatanatyam or any kind of South Asian dance, for us, women from courtesan caste, there is only a possibility of marginal existence. That too only when approved by Brahmin and upper caste called experts of history and performance, whose powerful claws hold both worlds hostage. Reparation and reconciliation can only be possible when these elitist spaces are depopulated with political and radical voices that question and ask for accountability. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nritya, for such a fiery and a radical presentation with no words minced. I won't come between her and the audience, but I also want to alert you to the fact that there is a lot more in her work. And in this domain, on the exact shifts in content, style, the bodily presence, and the space, as well as the genre, the shifts in genre, and how actually the content of Bharatanatyam has undergone a transformation. Maybe she will add, talk about all that in the question and answer. But now we'll go to the second speaker, Rai. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Hello everyone, good morning. Thank you, Nritya. I'm only marginally pleased that I'll be presenting something similar to your lines, and I'm very happy to present a part of my PhD work here, and even more happy to have to discuss this in the present company. The title of my paper is The Adivasi Widow and the Development of Property Rights, Rights Within the Family and Without. I'm going to be presenting a case study from my fieldwork conducted in 2018 to explore women and property regimes, and my work is socio-legal in nature. Since we're presenting for the panel of knowledge, traditions and law, I thought I'll begin by saying I would like to draw attention to the fact that law has many functions, as protecting people, as a form of social control, as an instrument to gain access to justice. Legal historian Henrik Hartog refers to law as an articulated structure of power and the law just as an arena of social struggle. More recent legal historians such as Rohit Dey makes a curious case. Smugglers, petty vendors, constitutes have shaped the constitutional culture. So, multiple strands by looking at the Santhal widow asserting land rights in the Birbhum district of West Bengal. While situating this Santhal widow in a socio-economic reality, I also look at the political tools that shape this reality according to a majoritarian idea of rights and rights over land as property. So the widow's landowner social status captures how these rights look when they percolate to the grassroots level. I also look at the sliver of a foothold in the propertied groups. So my paper is situated midway between these two movements, where the social and the individual meet and are putting pressure on each other. The premise of the paper is the idea that in order for my widow to come out ahead in litigation and claim land she considers important for her livelihood, she must present herself as a finite, rational, and autonomous individual in the eyes of the law, transcending her identities as within the family or community. Now, the argument that permeates the rest of the paper is that ostensibly the Santhal widow has inheritance rights that subscribe to an imagination of the ideal Hindu family unit. How? Women have been looked upon as this universal homogeneous category with reference to the propertied classes. So the legal debates have always centered around how much right they should have to alienate this property, especially income generating, immovable property in the form of land or house. For the women who fall outside the logic of private property, the currency has always been their labor. It strikes me their relationship to property therefore is also different. It is not to alienate fruit that bears the fruits of their labor, instead it has always been to belong. The hunger for gaining, owning, tilling land, as well as cleverly, creatively using everything that grows on it for sustenance, has resulted in movements for their right to self-determination, but within a larger rights-based praxis. It's this dichotomous idea of property rights for women, where on one hand, it is the right to alienate property as equal to men, and on the other, the desire to acquire or inherit land that one belongs to, a field of one's own that I try to bring out in my paper. Incidentally, property has two kinds, private and public. Law too is divided in terms of private and public spheres. Laws to separately govern the public and the private spheres of the people is understood as legal pluralism. As G. Arunima says in her work, dealing with the modernization of Mysore in the 19th century. It is a colonial legacy that introduced this split that had not existed earlier.
Disputes over property, therefore, invites the intervention of multiple normative orders governing the same problem. This is another understanding of legal pluralism. So how do we see this pluralism play out in customary as well as statutory rights at present? Firstly, I identify a category that reflects or contains the dual nature of property and law as that of the widow. The Hindu widow is a unique character in the landscape of gender and economy in India. She is known to suffer social death when her husband dies. At the same time, she represents that stage in the life cycle of a woman where she has concrete claims to property. So 100 years of lawmaking has gone into making her this central figure in Indian women's property rights discourse. From Right to Widow Remarriage Act in 1856 to the Hindu Succession Act in 1956, from being burnt as a sati to avoid being given property, she has gained the right to inherit her husband's property and all kinds of property with no clauses attached, such as whether she's chaste or has married again. So the initial question driving my research was, faced with the possibility of destitution, do widows go to court? What are the enabling and disabling conditions under which they go to court? The idea of deprivation still very much plagues her status. So then, why does she not go to the court and claim land if she has both social and legal sanction to property? This question was very important to me as literature points out that the relationship between widows and land continue to be very lean, and they are a vulnerable class of landlord or in perpetual mourning. Especially since I noticed that the tribe and caste women's labor was absolutely indispensable to the hometown. I would see these vast swathes of paddy field. The reason why Bengal has been called Shonar Ganga in the poet's imagination. And I would see these fields dotted over with sari-clad women sowing or harvesting or doing some other kind of agricultural work. And I thought, who do these fields belong to? And therefore I came to the question, what is the point of laws if they cannot change the society? What's stopping this change? And thus the Hindu Succession Act of 1956 becomes an important point of departure. Now, the Hindu Succession Act again governs women's rights in the private domain. It makes her a primary heir, same as that of the son. Agricultural land, however, does not fall under private property. In fact, a second law has to be taken into account if we want to study if rural agrarian widow going to court to claim land as a resource, if she's doing so that she doesn't face destitution or social death. So what is the second law? In 1955, zamindari or ownership of agricultural land as private property in India was abolished by introducing the Land Reforms Law at the center. This was done by putting a cap on the amount of land families could hold property known as the land ceiling. Land in excess of the ceiling was called surplus land and it got vested with the state government. It was redistributed to actual owners of the land who had, before this, no right or title to it, but had cultivated it all their lives. So land reforms are a product of agrarian reforms and they were considered to be most successful in West Bengal. Between the years 1967 and 86, the state legislature amended the West Bengal Land Reform Act of 1955, first to lower the land ceiling from 25 agriculture land, meaning factory land, land kept for grazing cattle, basically land that was not private, the land that was considered private property and was not agricultural. West Bengal finally introduced a land ceiling of 5 acres that can be held by a family of 5 to 7 people for personal cultivation. It was modeled after the Hindu joint family or the Hindu undivided family, which recognizes up to 9 members as a unit for tax exemption. If the landowners fail to cultivate it personally and it got it done by a peasant family for more than 2 years in a row, the latter can go to court and legally claim the land. Evidently, this was a step towards further abolishing private property. Now, let's keep in mind this was the law for the landowning family. The same law had a different approach towards the cultivating. She cooked up a so-called legal recipe to make sure, which worked, I'm not dissing it, To make sure land remained with the tillers, firstly, it did away with all the paperwork regarding land. The actual tiller was established by an on-spot verification method. The land reforms officers in the early 1970s would go to the field and ask for confirmation from neighbors and other peasants as to the rightful cultivator of this land. And the record of right was drawn up in the most systematic manner, where the names of these cultivators got included as an indelible record. You couldn't remove that at all by hook or by crook. So the two defining features of the cultivator's land, who now has right over this, is that first it's heritable, but only one family member can become the heir. Ostensibly because many heirs lead to land fragmentation and therefore reduced productivity. So here we see a distinct difference from the landowner's family and who has been treated by the same law and who inherit land as a unit or of a family. So the section 15A of the West Bengal Land Reform Act deals with succession, and it states that a no objection certificate from the other heirs of the family are required for the cultivator to become the next registered heir. This heir, whose name would be now registered in that indelible record of rights, and who is known as a sharecropper now, or a bargadar in the West Bengal context, should also be able-bodied, who will not keep the land fallow. To be able to cultivate the land is a primary clause to become an heir. So this is the first. Next, the land is not transferable. This property that is coming up through the second law. This land is not transferable. One could not gift, mortgage, sell this plot. This was done so that the land was not forcibly taken or bought back by the landowner, known as riot in the West Bengal context. Thus emerges a special kind of landed property, which is not private property, which has a title holder, but over which there is no right to alienation. This is very similar to the widow's estate. From before 1956, the widow had the right to maintenance as long as she lived, but she could not gift or sell the husband's property. She could only augment it. Similarly, over here in this cultivator lands or bargadar's land, the tiller or the bargadar had to share 1/4 of the produce with that of the landowner riot. This is called the golden ratio of 3:1. Now, if we reflect, the rural agrarian widow emerges as a double beneficiary if both the succession law and the land law come together to define her agricultural land. So, scheduled tribe women who are agriculturally active, therefore, are also eligible to inherit land. In the debarred their women from inheriting or owning land. But because tribes are considered Hindus, and they fall under the Hindu Succession Act, as land is made heritable in West Bengal. Therefore, the ST widow, in my study, becomes a double beneficiary, or also it's a distinct possibility. So very quickly on my methodology, because I need to mention where I got the names. I studied women who actually had already acquired the land. So it was not a speculation on do widows actually get land. It was about widows who have already received land. And to study this, I went to quasi-legal bodies, which are called block land and land reform offices, and it dots every state of every country, every district of every state in India. And I went to, my methodology was to see if widows are double beneficiaries, and I actually interviewed them. So I did a kind of legal ethnography to understand a legal culture. Legal culture and consciousness are lenses to look at the litigating population. And BLRO's other places came to me as an ethnographic site because it kept all the land records, oversaw all kinds of land-related disputes and other things such as mutation, conversion of land, rent of land. They kept the sharecropping case records. So you can say it was an ethnographic site in itself, as it gave me primary data, and land records were primary data for me. And it soon became clear, just by getting the names of these women from the land records who had already inherited land and interviewing them, it was not sufficient to have a holistic idea of the conditions under which they actually went to court. So I had to substantiate my interviews with the case law associated with the widow exercising her right over agricultural land. So next I access the order sheets, which are handwritten hearings of dispute cases in Bangla. They can be procured from the BLRO against a payment of 20 rupees stamp per page, and they can be produced as a valid document in any court of law. So I'm talking about like a very small quasi-legal court where like things are playing out at the grassroots level, where women are going and claiming land. So after which I come to my case study, and this case study from my research in Birbhum district of West Bengal, and this story is about Hukni Kisku, a scheduled tribe woman, widow, who got embroiled in legal dispute over 3 tins of paddy. So Hukni also refused to let me change her name for the purpose of this research. And her case is very interesting as she did not appear in the name by asking the Muhuris, those people, the legal agent who fill up your form outside a court. So these Muhuris were a constant presence outside the BLRO. The land reform officers actually come and go. They're not there. It's the nature of their job. So when I asked them about the women litigants, they said widow landowners don't exist. And it kind of did a blow to my hypothesis that widows can be double beneficiaries under where land laws succession rights in terms of productive labor. But the Muhuris had more deeper and generational knowledge. They told me about Hukni's case when I asked about women and land disputes, so I went to visit Hukni in her village. Hukni, however, considered herself a Bargadar, but said that she was taken to the court by her riots. And I was confused that if her name wasn't registered as a Bargadar, how could a case be brought against her? So I met her twice over a period of 5 to 6 hours each time. I spent my time with her on the field when she'd be threshing rice or gathering goats. I could not tell her age, but she was the widow and the third wife of a certain Potol Kisku. And her stepson Madan was in his early 50s. So I think she was around 60 years of age. And this is what Hukni told me. Potol, her ex-husband, used to cultivate 6 acres of land of a certain landholding family named Kundu as an agricultural laborer. So the Rayat Kundus were 3 brothers and their parents, constituting the prescribed landowning family of 5 members with a land ceiling of 5 acres. Only the agricultural land access to the ceiling devolved in Potol's eldest son Madan's name. He is now a registered Bargadar to the aforementioned Kundu with a land up to 1 acre. However, with the imposition of the fresh Bargar rule, after the amendment, put a ceiling on Kundu's non-agricultural land also. So there was a tussle between the 3 brothers trying every possible ways to get those land unvested in a Benami way, which was very rife in West Bengal at that point of time. But in the impossibility of which, one of the brothers began to illegally sell them. So Hukni told me at this juncture, she was approached by one of the Kundu brothers who sold her 24 decimals of land for 2,000 rupees and asked her to do the registry. But she was advised by CPM party workers, like, do not do the registry, give them 3 tins of paddy instead. Now, I did not understand the significance of 3 tins of paddy until and unless I went back to the BLRO to see why she was really embroiled in a legal battle, because it did not come out from the interview. And over a land that she has purchased, that she had not given by the state government. The order sheets in this juncture provided the following information. Firstly, it showed that she was a defendant and the riot had complained against her for not delivering a share of the produce. So this challenged my bias in looking for widows as petitioners coming to BLRO to only inherit land. Okay, I have 1 minute. I'll really wrap it up in 2. So the order sheet clarifies that the 24 decimals of land did not have a Bargadar. However, the unrecorded Bargadar's status was explained by the fact that the rights of the plaintiff was receiving a part of the produce from the opponent, and this was again the 3 tins of paddy made an appearance. So it was therefore clear that the land was exercising control over Hukni by making her appear in front of a legal body. And it was not a space of appearance where an individual actually willingly engages with the law. Not only was the land exerting control, but the whole logic of private property was playing out in the public domain. Hukni, whose labor turned a non-agricultural land, fertile productive piece, had to still deliver these 3 tins of paddy even in an informal arrangement. How is the state complicit in looking at Hukni as a propertied woman? Because now she has property which she has purchased. First, the state government did not dispossess Hukni, an Adivasi woman, from the land where she had been actively growing rice, especially more than 2 years, and this is known as the back calculation method. Second, the 3 tins of paddy implicated her in an official arrangements where she will have to cultivate the land as well as be answerable to the Riot and the land office. While the registry by itself, the third point is, while the registry by itself of a land sale in this circumstances would be completely illegal, the payment of the golden share in 3:1 ratio by the Adivasi woman, who was the wife of their long-term cultivator, made the arrangement amiable for everyone. 4, it did not go contrary to the state's policy, which wants to encourage land control amongst the land impoverished. 5th and the last point, by choosing a Bargadar according to one's liking and making some profit out of it, one of the Kundu brothers ensured that Hupni's state Adivasi widow landowner becomes concrete and someone he can exercise control over. So the relations of production had really not changed. So now just to conclude, and that, yes, sir. Brings us to some interesting aspects of property rights and the Adivasi woman. If you notice, I've suddenly made a shift from talking about the scheduled tribe woman to the term Adivasi. So this is evidently a case of litigious widow, and she did not go to court, and she went to court not to claim land, but to retain it. So this is a case of aftermath of litigation. The word scheduled tribe refers to a state-induced category, whereas Adivasi comes from an assertion of the self from within the tribes, carrying with it an autochthonous meaning of land and emotions attached to it. Both, however, are political categories. Although the ST category gives her land rights with safeguards against land alienation, Hupni is held captive to the succession rights regime by dint of her labor that now decide her fate and relationship with the land she has acquired. Similarly, the Riot family, visualized as a unit but not as individuals who can alienate land, becomes a category that still customarily has the propensity or capacity to alienate the land. It's a right that is enshrined in the family, although the West Bengal government made it so that the land acquired as a unit cannot be sold individually. Hupni has to navigate both the categories in order to emerge as a landowner, and by implicating tribes into a system of succession, inheritance, and ownership patterns that owes its genesis to a certain conceptualization of the ideal Hindu family, does not solve their issue of land ownership, especially that of the woman. We see this in the works of different authors, for instance, Virginia's Khaka, who discusses the problem behind Adivasi women inheriting land, becomes an issue within the community when she marries a non-Adivasi man. Because now this land will end up devolving along his line, because property is, after all, patrilineal. So we need to see Adivasi customs of adopting a son and inheritance of women in a way that looks at property itself anew, outside of the family, as in Hopni's case, where she's a single woman of a female-headed household. She ends up falling outside this imagination. Her rights as an ST woman, which is the state's way of treating her as a rational individual, becomes prominent, who is brought to the court because she failed to deliver the 3 tins of paddy 3 years in a row. She is brought to court to show her disability as an Adivasi despite the law giving her rights as an ST, ignoring the particularistic need for the land to belong, and by making the land shared, the state ends up giving up ways to methods of expropriation of the fruits of their labor. Within the rights-based paradigm, therefore, there is no freedom, and as Ratna Kapoor puts it, there is no freedom within the fishbowl. Thank you for letting me bring with me here.
Nilam.
Sorry, I overstepped. Oh,
Yes. Though there are more substantial and larger issues, Rai chose to present her subjective journey of field work and how she got there. But these issues also connect to bigger questions, which she will respond to when she answers your question. I now I'll invite Neela to make his presentation.
We are running late.
Just try to wrap up before allotted time. Thank you entire CTC community for this opportunity, and Sujata ma'am and Nritya and Rai for this very insightful presentation. And I'm just afraid if I'll be able to keep those like spirit of and enthusiasm. The paper or the idea I'll be presenting is how this state and market, the forces of state and market, particularly in terms of food system, are affecting the knowledge traditions among Adivasis. So I take the example of Chhattisgarh, Adivasis of Chhattisgarh, and I see how their knowledge tradition around food system are actually transformed, or how they are responding to that. So I'll begin with, because to make it clear, I'll begin with the principle of sustainable food system, a bit of that, and what indigenous food system is, and what the food system crisis that we are facing today. And then I'll take some policies. I'll just surface through one of the policies, MSP of rice eligible route, and then I'll go to the question of where the problem lies, the epistemology of conceiving food system or tribals. So I'll end there. So what is the principle of sustainable food system? Is that humans or even non-humans have this accessibility of affordable, healthy food that are produced, even processed, that are produced in ways that are non-degrading, that are non-violent, I mean for both humans and non-humans, and that are sustained for generations to come. What is this indigenous food system? I mean, it will be more clear when we come to the landscapes. That includes community, that includes the entire knowledge traditions of not just indigenous people or the Adivasis, but then from the time of foragers, how we have developed through those developed knowledge of acquiring foods from including wild variety, or then we shifted to agriculture. So all the entire knowledge is included. So very typical to indigenous food system that exists today are centered to this food system is seed, that we often miss out, is that seed is centered to entire process of agriculture production. So if somebody says that, say this is organic, so but I believe that organic is one of the biggest scale entire story. Half of it will skip your lunch and go back home. So this is very dangerous thing that is happening. So second is processes that are, I mean, knowledge is about processes of food production that includes seeds, landscapes, land, soil, whatever, and the entire resources, includes water, etc., and community that are very important in sustaining, including seeds, landscapes, and ecosystem. For example, just an example of that, if I have to sustain any seed for generations to come, I need a community that which first believes in that seed should be shared for free. Second, that they have to have a way to exchange seeds and to maintain the quality of soil. Example, so that I need to exchange the seed variety even within my field. That means if I'm changing the seed, somebody else has to cultivate that seed in his land, in her land, and so that the next year I can borrow those seeds. So these are some of the processes where community morality, the knowledge tradition is so important. So which is still found in indigenous people community. Other things that are given less attention is that indigenous people are often located in less inhabitable soils or territories, and they have developed ways to cultivate certain amount of foods, and also they have recognized, even our ancestors, all of our ancestors have cultivated knowledge of wild food. So most of their food comes from wild, or from forest or cultivated lands where associated wild varieties are which is very difficult to for example, for those who do not apply lipstick, it is very difficult to distinguish between the 50 shades of red you say, right? But for those who do that, it's very simple. So this is some of the ways to understand how indigenous knowledge works. So getting back to the modern food system crisis is that, and where we locate indigenous food system and how it responds to the policies that are being either either given to them or enforced. So we can identify, we can match. So modern food system, the centrality of modern food system crisis is that we are depending more and more on less and less variety of what do you call grains or edibles. So we are rich in calories, for example, but very poor in nutrition. So that is one of the crises. Secondly is that there are a lot of violence in the processes of food production, including your milk. There is a lot of violence for cows and buffaloes, etc. So nothing is non-violent in the sense. Those who vegetarians, those who claim to be so non-violent, it's very difficult. In humans, and not just for ये food के पास साथ बस ऐसा नहीं होता है. So that is one thing that you have to keep in mind, and these all processes are actually supported or enacted by the force of first market and second state. Market because they want profit and they want monoculture for their entire processes, and for state those who look for homogeneity. For example, for policy implementation, they need homogeneous policy making, and also because they have less understanding of complexities of this food system within this diverse knowledge tradition. So that is where I locate my argument, that I take example of MSP, maximum support price of rice, and how they have changed the knowledge tradition or the food system among the Adivasis. First in monoculture, MSP looks so benign. So under the entire benign image of the benign welfare state, they have a very regressive impact on indigenous people. First, what MSP has done is that obviously it has increased the capacity, income of farmers across India, and especially in Chhattisgarh, because it's one of the highest paid MSP for rice. It's like 28. It's unimaginable even within the welfare state system. So what this has done, it has neglected or overlooked the diversity of indigenous people, the amount of rice, the varieties they are having, right? So more and more indigenous people or Adivasis are getting into less and less varieties of rice. So for MSP, even the procurement policies, they look that there is a homogeneity in procurement. So they don't take your heirloom varieties because they are smaller in sizes. So everyone is producing more and more one kind of hybrid varieties of rice. That is one thing. Second thing is, obviously there are lots of seeds. For example, there was a scientist called Richarya, the contemporary of Swaminathan, the Harit Kranti, and so he had almost 36,000 of rice varieties kept in Raipur. I don't know, they sold it to Motherboard, a seed company by Microsoft. I don't know, something happened to that, but that's the story of just one variety of edibles, rice. So these diversities we have lost. That is what is happening through the welfare state system that gives industry. Second is transformation of landscapes. So initially the tribals used to plant more and more varieties of rice and diverse grains, including millets, maize, etc. But now you see same varieties of rice or paddy across fields. So dangerous particularly for climate change, etc. Because climate change invites more pest attacks, and if monoculture is more prone to pest attacks, so that is very dangerous. Second thing, what is happening is people are transforming these tribal people. Neither they have lands, they have already transformed their lands, they have already lost their seats, they have already lost their cultural community where they used to without money they used to cultivate and procure their paddies. So these are very dangerous trajectories that we are getting into. Second thing is even pesticide. These hybrid rice varieties, they inherently need pesticides and fertilizers. One of the biggest impact that has happened is that they have lost all the associated wild varieties that were edible within the fields. So they have plenty of, including mushrooms and other. Secondly, what they have lost is fish. They used to have plenty of fish, and they used to conserve it for the rest of the years, and that was an important source of protein for them. So that was another important, significant impact that has happened. So this is how we see that impact of state and market that is looking for homogeneity and also for profit. Therefore, this paper suggests that there need to be a repurposing of agricultural subsidies, not in more sustainable way. Not all subsidies are bad, but neither they are all good for all places. So it is not about eliminating agricultural support, but also ensuring that support works as intended. This means that policy instruments chosen should be well in line with the explicit objectives, and that inevitable trade-offs and unintended impacts are anticipated beforehand and considered in the decision-making processes. So, and these entire line of policy making are reflected even in language and education. For example, just an example of education is that even tribal people, if they want to learn maths, they have to learn other 3 or 2 languages to learn maths. So they are left far. They have to learn first Hindi, then English, then maths. So these are some of the things that have not reflected in the entire policy making. There are few things going around the world to actually fight these mismatch of policy, law, etc. They are calling this decolonization from indigenous perspective. I just list it. I'll just surface through it. One is of New Zealand. They are calling it decolonizing methodology. Right? So what they suggest is that our entire philosophy or epistemology is coming from European enlightenment based on individualization, automation, breaking things in units and studying that. So you have to get out of that. In America, particularly in Puerto Rico, they are calling it decolonial methods. So they suggest that it started with the Columbus 1492, and what they are doing is we should come together and produce our own methods. In South America, they are calling it decolonial. They are calling it decoloniality also. What they're suggesting is that we have to produce our own concepts, rooted in indigenous way. In Africa, they are indigenization, something else. They are calling it that it's a more of French structure that is defining our way of thinking. And we need decolonizations. And there is in Portugal, there is an epistemology of the South, we are calling it. What they are doing is that they have to depart from the European trajectory of knowledge making. What they are claiming is that fundamental to Europe is that it has lost its ability to learn. Right? Europe. Second is that what they teach, they do not practice. European countries, including human rights dialogue, etc., refugee problems, etc. So what they are saying is that there is not one single universal epistemology or not single way, and there are plural ways. For example, if in India if indigenous people or tribals had been kept in mind during that linguistic state framework, so we would be having 500 more states. So that's what they are claiming. In India, I think there is a group called Tribal Intellectual Collective. What they are calling themselves is that it's an epistemological decolonization. First thing they are attempting is that we have to their fundamental attempt is to that our entire epistemology is alienated, and we have to reclaim that and establish because they are particularly focusing on methodology, which is basically Greek centered, like those Ontos, entire thing, objects. I won't get into those ontology debates, and that is how they are claiming that. Lastly, I will suggest along with Ubuntu, these are some of the not develop instead of developmentality, they are well-being. Well-being that includes the well-being of environment, animal, human, and non-human. Ubuntu we are already speaking. Third is Sumanta Kause. Beyond the they are calling it. It's rooted in cosmological worldview. That means it's from Quechua people from Andes, which is basically coexistence with diversity. Uh, uh, Thirdly, fourth thing is vinculiritat, difficult to pronounce, but that implies a relationality with all the living and non-livings that surrounds us and the cosmic life that made that cosmos possible. Knowledge, tradition on food, which are probably more sustainable. But lastly, even certain tribes, those who have these moral, the concept of moral community, the concept of moral community, right? So these are some of the inputs. Probably I'm a bit lost in this last, but then this is what alternatives of knowledge tradition and the impact they are making and the responses that are happening across the world. Thank you very much.
I've been getting as possible. What we will do, we should take these presentations as a glimpse to a particular point of view that the speaker is trying to evince. Actually, like it always happens, by the time you reach the crux of the point, the time is, has worked on Ragini as a genre of music, and how the Ragini, which is a popular genre, has actually migrated from one community to another. There's a migration both of community and of gender and the content, from genealogy to erotic content. That's her work. But today she will only discuss the papers presented here very briefly, highlight some key questions, and then we will take questions. Maybe the speakers may not have the time to answer all the questions. We will consider the discussion at over lunch or session.
It's a beginning.
Yes.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you
Put
so
it on,
much.
yeah.
Thank you so much for first of all having me here and for this opportunity to be part of this such an enriching experience. And honestly, I felt, while going through all the three presentations, as if I'm sitting in a village, and and listening to different contexts of plurality. Like Nitya began with the whole, it's I think it's marvelous the way she's been able to voice the resistance, so voicing the resistance on our public stage in itself is the beginning of change. So, very congratulations for that. I think, and it's not easy, it's not easy to come forward while you've been through so many, challenging experiences, generations of, challenging experiences. While Nitya was talking about how this whole reform movement came about, and this anti-Devdasis movement that came about, and I'm sorry, because it's also about relationality. I would also like to point out that around the same time, if you see in the north, there was anti-Nautch movement that was going on. And so what a wonderful this context is, and how beautifully she not only talks about that how the genre which belonged to a particular community is taken away, is being alienated from the original performers, and under the aegis of this so-called, purifying the performing arts. So, taking it from them, the original sources, to the ones, that's, they're prevailing in a way which matches the normative beliefs of in the society. And she also talks about that how gestures, was being defined, and that's, I can, because I've also worked on Ragini, so I've also interviewed a lot of singers. So similar sort of parallels I can draw from there, that how so not only that, but at the same time there was movement from private spaces to the public spaces of performance as well. As Simantini Niranjana talks in her book New Mentions of Music, that there was this whole reform movement, and aligned with that, with the intervention, and later on the intervention invention of technology. This movement was happening, from the darbars, from the kacheris. These performances were being taken to the public spaces, and to whom the public space belonged. That's and I think we need to understand the social history and the context in which her whole study and her experience, lived experience of alienated from the original performance form. I'm sorry, because I have paucity of time, I want to really want to. I might take an hour to finish. So I won't take that. I won't take that. So not only the genre, the structure changed. Yes, ma'am. The structure changed, and the composition of the performing arts, of the particular genre is changing, and it certainly has, and it should be seen in a relational ways, gender, caste, class, how market is playing role, and what is the, So thank you, and Nitya, for such a wonderful deliberation, and I'm really sorry, but I must congratulate reclaiming, the knowledge, through this sort of a way. And thank you so much. So next, so moving on to, as I was saying, I felt I was sitting in a village. So look at the land structure. I mean, like how Adivasi widow is, struggling with her rights, the basic ones, and which again we saw the how the state and the law is so while she was, in fact, all through the three delegations, I felt, one can see the struggle of agency and structure all the time, which it illustrates so beautifully in these case studies, and thank you, Rai, for a wonderful, deliberation, and for, I'm sorry, I'm just moving on to the third one.
Take some questions.
Yeah, please. So, okay, so the last one is, it brings forth the very important question of where the knowledge is emerging from, the folk, the indigenous, through the dance, the land, like, and the way he's bring forth a very contemporary, crisis that we are living in these days, when, we would of course prefer, organic over a simple sort of food. So so it's wonderful to see that how looking at the, this profit motive more, so as to and process the indigenous practices are being marginalized, and rather he stresses more upon that sustainable development is what the country is looking for, and sustainability is something we should we should have sustainable mode of food practices, and for that he says that we need to perhaps that we need to go back to our roots, we need to go back to the indigenous knowledge, we should keep on referring to and for to the indigenous knowledge systems, and sorry.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Some questions, no discussion. What do you think?
Questions, even questions over lunch.
Yeah, and we can send questions on mail. No, I don't think that we can take questions, sorry.
I think this session, next session.
Next session will be delayed and he has to leave early. He has a flight. She has a flight in the
Flight.
Why did not get delayed?
So I don't think we can take questions. So what we can do is, we can collect questions and give it to them, and we can have conversation over.
Collect questions now?
Yeah, now. They can
Yes.
just give it to us. They can write questions.
Or write the questions and
Okay,
give it
no,
to
no,
you.
And
Yeah.
give it to you. And then we can share. Is that okay?
Or we can speak over lunch, I think.
No, that is fine, but also we should know, so if
Formally.
you can either send questions on mail
On mail.
or on the group. You can provide a mail ID.
Okay.
Where you can get all the questions. And we can
So talk about the next session, we are starting exactly at 2:15. Then if only the presenters are there, we'll start.